Hello, and welcome to History Chats. So, this time of year, you might be seeing a lot of a particular type of plant out in the wild. This being the clover. Obviously, it is a plant that is very much associated with St. Patrick's Day and Irish heritage, which, of course, for good reason there. Um, but also interestingly, this is a crop. This humble little plant. This grows wild in the area here in central Wisconsin. Um, it's three little leaves, or maybe four. There's that luckiness associated with four or more leaves. But there's a different sort of luck, which is that it happens to grow very extensively here in central Wisconsin. And something that you might not be as familiar with is the fact that the clover is arguably responsible for the development of Wisconsin as a whole into the leading dairy producer in the United States. Certainly, this area gets its start in dairying, and one of the big selling points of this area, in sort of north central Wisconsin, so to speak, is the fact that clover is so abundant here. In fact, they call it, for a period of time, the Clover Belt. So, how does this come to be? Well, it's worth noting that initially, of course, there are farmers that are active before this all takes place. Homesteads had been set up. The early inventing of farming in kind of two different directions. There's the small experiments with farms to raise some produce to help kind of offset the supplying of the lumber industry in the mill towns that are emerging. But there's also immigrants like the Germans who come and settle in large numbers in the 1850s and 60s, kind of getting that start. And they are going to be the first farmers, but they're not really farming in the sense that we would expect them to in the 20th century or the 21st. And instead, we'll come back to them, but I think instead, the big industry here is pine trees, cutting the pine trees. Like that's really the plant that is the most responsible for the early settlement of central Wisconsin, because people were coming here to cut the trees down and turn them into boards, and that industry is what really grows these communities. But there's a problem with that, which is that as time goes on, it becomes more and more evident that the future of the lumber industry is not long, right? This is not going to be an industry that, by the turn of the century, it's on the decline. This is not going to be the thing that sustains and continues to grow communities in, the north half of Wisconsin, say. In part because of the train, right? The railroad comes through, and this exponentially accelerates the process of the deforestation because now we can just, put a little line of the trains through and just come through and clear cut acre after acre, put them on the trains and send them away. And this leads to the turn of the century in which, okay, what do we do now? Like, clearly the future is not going to be in lumbering. And so many communities that are already in existence or kind of in their beginning, they turn to try to find other industries. Maybe they're making other things, other manufacturing or paper, for example, right, is kind of common. Maybe they go in other directions. But ultimately, one of the ways, like the cities themselves, the villages, they can find some other manufacturing, other industry, but the land that had been forested is also kind of not being used. Except it is, right, because of homesteads, because people are bringing in and farming, and that's kind of the desired outcome. Let's find a use for this. Yes, there's some stumps. Get some dynamite or something. That's one way that they got rid of all of those stumps. But you have all of this former forest land that is, ripe to be turned into something else, so let's farm. But again, this is farming in the sense that they are farming as part of a larger lifestyle, as part of a homestead, right? Now that's going to change, and to understand why, let's talk about this for a second. Let's say I have a farm here, right? Now, how much produce am I going to expect to plant, right? How much corn should I plant? Or how many, sheep or cattle, dairy cows, should I expect to have? Well, the issue isn't necessarily a matter of scale here. If you can plant an acre, in theory, you could plant 100 acres of corn. But the problem is not necessarily scaling, although it's not easier said than done. It's distance to the market, right? You can print a lot or smaller, but really that size is going to be dictated more about the access to send it to the market, right? The distance involved makes it kind of difficult. And the market here is, the communities, like certainly if you're homesteading, in the town of Berlin, you can send some of your crops to Wausau or some of the laboring, the local lumber communities. But really, there's not a huge population there for your corn or wheat or beans. And so, but if you happen to be in the vicinity of a major market like Milwaukee or Chicago, that's different. And so what we tend to see is early farming as a industry, as agriculture, is not necessarily happening here at the sort of extremities of society and the pioneer, but instead close to the cities. So that's what we typically see. But there's a thing that's happening in the 1800s because, yes, this reality means that the farms tend to be very small. But by the 1870s and 80s, we start to see railroads show up. And other improvements to the infrastructure mean that suddenly there is a connecting point. Maybe not directly to Chicago or Milwaukee or these big cities, but they're partly in part of this commodification. So your corn that you grow here in central Wisconsin by the end of the 1800s can be sent elsewhere in the country. And so there's this incentive to expand, along with some other, more technical stuff that we don't need to get into. This means that farms here in central Wisconsin aren't in their own little world. Increasingly, they're connected into this larger system. So, this is the industrialization of agriculture. And when we talk about industrialization, usually in most contexts, we're talking about like factories and cities, but this is an important part of this too. Because again, it's not necessarily about the output of a factory or a farm. You could make a factory, like certainly that's a big improvement in the 1800s, and this new industrial revolution is how to make, shoes at scale. Instead of having a cobbler make handmade one at a time, you can, break it into its part in an assembly line, and you can mass produce shoes. But where's that market? Part of the industrialization is a distribution system, so you can get the corn or those shoes to the market where it is. And like today, if I go to the store and I buy a bag of potatoes, I don't know where those potatoes came from. Does it come from Idaho? Michigan? I don't know. Now maybe even it says there, even if it does say Idaho, well, where in Idaho? What farm? Because it doesn't really matter, right? In the same way that if I have a glass of orange juice in the morning, where did those oranges grow? Florida, California, Brazil? It really doesn't matter necessarily. We don't care as long as the end product is still good. And this is the commodification of these things. Again, this is all good in some ways because it means that people who want to get involved in farming as a profession, as a way to make their living, they can do that without having to be right next to a city. So this, by the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, opens the door for agriculture as a business, even here in central Wisconsin, which previously wasn't the case. And a good example of this is dairy farming, right? Dairy is specifically one of those crops. If I milk a cow and I've got a gallon of milk, well, I can't put that on a horse and buggy or a wagon driven by oxen or take it down the river, which is what you'd have to do back in the 1860s. That's going to especially go bad, even more than a thing of potatoes. So what we end up seeing is that, yes, Wisconsin very early on is involved in wheat production, but we shift by the mid-1800s to dairy farming. But most of the dairy farms that are happening in the southeast part of the country, of the state, right? So this, for example, is the cover from a report, kind of the proceedings of a annual convention that the Wisconsin Dairymen's Association starts. This is 1874. And I'm using this as the second convention because it actually has a publication of all of its members. And if you put them on a map, these are the counties that are represented. Again, this is where the population of the state of Wisconsin tends to be, so you want that close by. But that's not going to be the way forever. Jump ahead a few decades, and you get to the 33rd convention, which happens to be held in Wausau. This is kind of a big deal. Up to this point, they hadn't really had the convention up here, this far north. I think like Chippewa Falls is maybe the furthest north, and that's kind of on its own area there. Green Bay, maybe. But here, this is representing the sort of opening of the central part of the state, the Northwoods, the cutover region, for dairying. And this is a big theme here. And one of the big things that keeps coming up in this, because again, this is a publication that has like all of the speeches and reports and kind of discusses what's been discussed. One particular speech that I'm going to quote from here is a paper given by a Wausau guy, John Lamont, who talks specifically about clover as being an important component to why this area is going to be good for dairy farming. He says that, quote, clover is listed as the greatest of all forage plants for the dairy cow. And here it grows not only abundantly, but with a luxurious extravagance that is beyond belief of any who never gave this section close study. And what a wonderful plant it is. It gives you twice the return of fodder that Timothy does, and at the same time enriches and puts into the soil elements necessary to the growth of any crop. Any kind of crop. While its top is giving forage, its roots are working overtime, storing the nitrogen so necessary to the soil. No farmer who persistently and intelligently grew clover ever had a worn-out soil. High praise for this little thing, right? And it just so happens that, Wausau, and this is part of the central part of this area that clover grows really well. So if clover is going to be important for dairy farming, hey, you're looking for the future of dairy in Wisconsin, it's up here. Now, just in case you didn't catch it, why is clover important? It's not necessarily evident, right? Well, on one hand, like he said, it's great for forage. It's not the only thing you can use for this, and very frequently, like alfalfa is pretty common, and there were other, alternatives, cowpea and Timothy, right? But clover is really good for this. It's very nutritious for the cows, so you can feed them by having them graze. But it's also important because dairy farmers aren't just raising cattle, they're also farming. So they also have, other crops, corn, peas, potatoes, not so much wheat here in central Wisconsin, but, these sort of crops, right? So let's just talk about corn. Corn is a great crop. It grows pretty well here. Especially if you have fertilizer you can add to the soil, like, say, a herd of dairy cattle that you can use, their excrement for. So you mix that into the soil, great. It's great for growing corn. But the problem is that, like any crop, most crops, corn doesn't grow particularly well if you don't, let the soil recover. It uses all the nutrients in the soil. And so typically what they would do is they would plant a crop of corn, and then they would move on to a different plot the next year and let that former plot kind of rejuvenate. Fallow is what they call it, lay fallow. Well, if you plant clover there in the meantime, clover doesn't compete for the same resources that corn does. And in the meantime, it creates a ground cover, so the soil isn't going to erode, right? Even better, at the end of the season, after the cows have foraged, you can also make hay with it, which is pretty cool. I should also say here, it's maybe not clover. I'm not entirely sure here. But yeah, you can make hay from it. You can feed your animals. At the end of the season, you can take what's left and plow it under, and that greenery is going to help to enrich the soil again. And there's also this idea of nitrate, which Lamont mentioned there. But essentially, they don't quite understand how this works, but they know that certain crops, clover, alfalfa, cowpea, legumes of some sorts, they have this ability to take nitrogen or nitrates from the air and infuse it back into the soil, which is really good for growing other crops. So you can see how that clover is not necessarily an end goal here, but it really supports the larger ecosystem of dairy farming in the 1800s, in the turn of the century, right? And it still is used. Of course, you go out to a dairy farm today, chances are there's some, clover or alfalfa being used, in some combination. And so, again, why is this important? Well, we have a lot of great clover that grows here naturally, So if you're looking to, say, become a dairy farmer or a farmer of any sort, come here. This is a little cartoon here saying, he's going right. Whichever way this young man takes, he can't miss it so long as he travels towards the clover belt. This clover belt is an interesting concept. This, again, gets brought up pretty frequently in the 1905 convention here in Wausau of the Dairymen's Association. But let's talk about where that comes from. So back in the 1890s, into the turn of the century, this gets brought up. This is not necessarily a given that this is the clover belt in the same way that, like, the corn belt or whatever, that can also be contested before it ultimately is like, oh, this is a great place to, Iowa or whatever. There's a lot of clover belts. And in fact, just some examples here. And these are just a couple of headlines that, get the idea across. There's a lot more. Arkansas, here's some land in the corn and clover belt of Arkansas. Indiana, red clover belt of Indiana. The Great Clover Belt of Minnesota and Wisconsin. The Minnesota Clover Belt. Michigan has a clover belt. Ohio is said to have been that. Kansas, Indiana, Illinois, the Midwest. There's a lot of clover belts. Now, what's interesting here is that during this period, one of the things that they're doing, and they're talking here like, the amount per acre net. Well, partly what they're doing here is not necessarily using clover as the supporting crop for these other things, but as a commodity itself. Clover is a thing that everybody would love to plant. And so if you harness the seeds, you can use that as a thing that you can sell on. And that actually is a going concern. Apparently it was actually a major export to Germany. So German farmers back in Europe were using American clover seed, at least for a while. But ultimately, this seems to kind of collapse as a commodity. It's not really as in demand. And so the clover belt evolves. And a little after the turn of the century, you have things like this. And this is, I think, an important part of how it gets associated with Wisconsin. This is a thing talking about the clover belt. And you'll note that the land that they're trying to sell you for clover and dairy production, right to the land agent of the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie Railway in Minneapolis. Central Wisconsin and the Sault Ste. Marie merged to become the Sioux Line, right? Yeah, they've got a lot of land through what would be considered the Clover Belt. In fact, here's another ad here. This is from 1904. This is from a variety of, it picked up all over the place. But it advertises land in these counties, which it says is going to be the North Wisconsin Clover Belt. It will someday be the paradise of dairy farming. And again, the land superintendent of the Central Wisconsin Railway. So I think the railroad people, the people associated with land agents selling land under the auspices of the railroad, they gravitate and grab this idea of the Clover Belt. And then by 1905, it starts to be picked up by the locals as sort of a way to stand out as well. But again, like looking at what is considered the Clover Belt, this is an interesting choice. This happens to be a place where the Sault Ste. Marie, or the Sioux Line and Wisconsin Central have a lot of land available. Even a decade later, in 1915, this is coming from the Des Moines, Iowa, published in their local paper. All of these places that are trying to sell you land in the prosperous Wisconsin dairy farm area, the land of clover. If you graph this out again, like I did, these are apparently the areas that are considered to be in the Clover Belt. Now, arguably, this one's a bit of a stretch, right? I think Marathon, there's an argument to be said, does Wausau considered maybe? Certainly the folks in Wausau said that we are at the heart of it, and it extends as far as Antigo. I think it's also, understandable to maybe use the Wisconsin River as kind of the stop point, and anything west of there kind of works, but east of there, maybe not so much. Certainly the farming communities popping up in the western part of the county, Colby, Unity, Abbotsford, Athens, Edgar, Marathon, Stratford, Spencer, all of those communities are considered part of the Clover Belt too. But again, this is a graph representing what a bunch of land agents that are trying to sell you land are claiming to be. And ultimately, I think that, we can say, well, okay, let's just look at this. We compare this to the map of the early dairy industry in the 1870s. There's a shift happening here, right? We go from the southeast to the northwest. Now, in reality, are all of this land here getting bought? No, not even close. By the mid 20s, it becomes pretty obvious that, like, Oneida, Vilas counties, Florence, this is not going to be prime real estate for farming. There's some attempts up there, but it just doesn't really take. The climate's a little too rough, the growing season's too short, the soil is not as good over, here as it is over here. But some of this definitely takes, right? And this idea of the clover belt continues to be really important and embraced in some of these places, like here in Marathon County. Since the 1860s, Marathon County has had a county fair held outside of Wausau, in Wausau, essentially. It's a Marathon Park, right? The fairgrounds. It's not a park at this point, but you know what I mean. Well, at the turn of the century, they start to make a real concerted effort to acknowledge the fact that farming isn't just happening in the vicinity, in the hinterland around Wausau and Mosinee along the river, but further westward. And in partially because of this, they adopt a new name for the entire fair. It becomes branded as the Clover Belt Fair. This starts around 1906 and continues until about 1920. By 1921, they rebrand as the Wisconsin Valley Fair, which is what they're known as today. But for a long time, this was the Clover Belt Fair, right? And this represents this acknowledgement of the Clover Belt as an important force for the growing agricultural sector. And it's a pretty good one. So this is one of a few examples of a booth that was set up. These gentlemen here are part of a committee that would take the best of the produce produced in the agricultural community in Wausau, or in Marathon County, I should say, and then take that from Marathon Park. They would take it down to Milwaukee to the state fair and show here's what we have. And it was actually like a judged thing, and Marathon County won a lot. So here they are. I think this is 1918, 1919. Got the blue ribbon. They won more often than they didn't. First, second. It was rare that we fell out of the top three throughout the 19 teens. And you can see here, of course, it's the Clover Belt exhibit. Now, just as a side note, I think that some of these people, like these guys here, these are the Cook brothers from Unity. In particular, the guy on the right, his name is Lewis Cook. He's moved to Wausau by this point to get involved in politics and in printing and some stuff. But he, in order to do that, sold the farm, I think around that time. Maybe he still had it at this point. But his farm, just as an interesting note, is another variation on this. This is from a little earlier in Unity, like a little display of the farm's bounty. And we can see here, it is the Cloverdale. That's the name of the farm, Cloverdale Farm. So another variation there. But yeah, with the Cooks and with other people in the western part of the county kind of bringing, this becomes an important part of creating the idea. And like the Clover Belt is really successful. So this is from 1924. This is sort of an overview of the history and the current trends in cheese making in Wisconsin. I know, pretty exciting. But it's kind of cool. Flipping through it, you might find here about the history in the recent years, it says this. Recent years have seen a tendency of the cheese industry in the state to move northwestward, away from the centers of denser population in the southeastern corner, and the Clover Belt region, centering around Marshfield and Wausau, has begun to usurp the honors of the largest production long held by the lakeshore counties. So there you go. By the 1920s, it's pretty clear that this isn't just a upstart little area. This is where the center of dairy farming and the culture surrounding that is. But, excuse me, if it's successful, why are we not? I mean, if you look at the historical record, this idea that this is the Clover Belt might be kind of a unique thing. Like, you might not know that that's the case, because by the mid-1920s, by the end of the 1920s, really, they pretty much stopped using the term. So why? Well, I think there are kind of three things to consider here. One, the branding was successful. From the early years of the new century through to the 1920s, this is a formative time in which we need to try to convince people that, yes, there's good farmland here in central Wisconsin. Come up to the cutover region, right? And it did it. So by the 1920s, because we are surpassing the lakeshore region in terms of the production, the number of farms here, you don't need to brand yourself as a belt of anything. It just is the place where it's happening. And that branding isn't necessarily the most helpful, it turns out. Because, again, clover isn't a commodity. It's a thing that supports the other commodities, the dairy products that you're creating, the corn, the potatoes, whatever. It's an important part of that ecosystem, but that isn't necessarily the most obvious. And so, yes, clover grows really well here, but what does that mean, right? To the public, that isn't necessarily evident. And also, it's worth noting that clover isn't necessarily the preferred version of this. Like alfalfa is still pretty popular. And even by like the 1930s, there's a lot of discussion about, hey, we should be doing more with this clover stuff because, okay, one of the downsides of the clover is just as like corn will remove those nitrates and you need to put them back into the soil. Turns out clover does the same thing in a sense. It turns the soil kind of acidic, and it does not grow well in acidic soil. So yes, it grows really well here, but you can't continue to grow it that way. So you need to put something else into the soil, like lime is the way that you do this, and then you can get it ready. And again, that just adds some extra complexity to make it not quite so straightforward as you just need corn, clover, and dairy cows, right? But thirdly, it's not actually gone. A lot of it is, right? We don't necessarily refer to this area as the clover belt in the same way, but it sticks around. Now, some of the things like the baseball league here, this is the Clover Belt League. This is from the Eau Claire. So, the Wausau Lumberjacks might go to Chippewa Falls or Mondovi, I don't know, wherever they're going over there. And they play baseball. And I'm going to use this even though this isn't technically accurate. This sort of farm league, if you will, names itself after what the region was kind of being called about in the 19 teens and early 20s, which is the Clover Belt, right? Just a couple other examples throughout the years. This is a advertisement for a Farmers Institute in Athens, and for entertainment, they bringing in the Clover Belt Band, which existed from about 1907 to 1908. I don't know much more about this, but hey, let's name the band the Clover Belt. Another example here, the Schultz's Meat Market in Wausau. They have a Clover Belt brand summer sausage, right? You'll miss half the enjoyment of your outing or fishing expedition if you neglect to take along a sufficient supply of Clover Belt brand summer sausage. Sounds good. Kind of does, actually. There's a seed store. Again, Clover Belt seed kind of continues to be a long thing. So they continue through the 20s. There is a co-op, a Clover Belt co-op, which starts in, I want to say 1929, but it might have been I think it's in the 30s. To sell, again, supplies to farmers, equipment and oil particular, because, tractors become kind of an important thing as we get into mechanized farming. There's also just, the local brewery had a Clover Belt beer, version of beer that they called the Clover Belt. It's all over the place, right? There's a whole bunch of, obviously, farms, cheese factories, dairies, creameries that adopt the name Clover Belt. There's also this school here. This is in the town of Wausau, I should say, so just northeast of the city of Wausau, the Clover Belt School, which continues, well into, I think, the 50s, and then everything gets consolidated by that point. But it makes its way into other things. Stratford, 4-H is a good example of this too. 4-H clubs get started in the 20s, and they adopt a familiar symbol for that purpose. 4 instead of 3 leaves, but But anyway, their 4-H club, which originally starts as just before 4-H as a brand or a thing, it's the Clover Belt Achievement Club of Stratford, and so they become part of the 4-H. They drop the achievement, and it just becomes the the Clover Belt Club. So you see the name continues to be important, even if the local 4-H people these days aren't part of the Clover Belt Club. Some of it does continue, right? Again, that youth sort of cooperation back in, I think this is 1929. They establish a conference. It might have even been earlier. I looked this up. Anyway, it's fine. Either way, around this time, it's not important exactly what the date was. But, if you today are, a volleyball player at Spencer High School, you might travel over to, I don't know, Cadott, or to, Eau Claire or whatever, and you're part of the Clover Belt Conference. And again, it gets started as this name is in the zeitgeist, and so it just continues. Even if if you're playing golf or football in the Clover Belt League, you probably have not much of an understanding that this is actually like because of dairy farming and the advocacy of trying to replace the lumber for dairy, but that's what it is. Uh, just a second example of something that you might still know. Of course, Clover Belt has another indication. The co-op that I talked about of the machine shops and oil company for farmers out of Wausau, well, they pretty quickly start a credit union for their members, and that becomes the Clover Belt Credit Union, which is still around today, outlasted the rest of the company or the association. Still very successful. In fact, this building, their headquarters in Wausau here, is a block away from the Historical Society. So, yeah. The Clover Belt name, and I would note that it's Clover Belt, not Clover Belt, right? That has changed. The old way of seeing it as the Clover Belt, that may have disappeared, but Clover Belt is not completely gone. And for that, again, do people, doing their finances with the Clover Belt Credit Union have any idea that it has to do with dairy farming? Probably not, but it does. Thanks to this simple crop that, hey, you might not give it much credit. It's a little tiny thing, and you might not even recognize the importance that it has had in the development of central Wisconsin. But if it hadn't been for that branding, who knows? Maybe central Wisconsin wouldn't have become as successful as a dairy, destination for dairy farmers, and that might not have put us over the edge to become the Dairyland of America. Probably would have done well, but yeah. So there you go. Now you know the story of Clover and how it has come to be. Now, did I intend for this to come out on St. Patrick's Day? Yeah, but as you can see, it got a little bit more complicated as it tends to do sometimes. So, it is what it is. But that is the program. Thanks for watching. Yeah, we'll see you next time for some more history chats. In the meantime, have a good rest of your day. Evening, night. How do I end this?